The town of Ashwood, nestled deep in the wooded hills of New England, had all the trappings of a picturesque postcard: cobblestone streets, weathered cottages with white picket fences, and a community that seemed to thrive on tradition. But, like all small towns with a long history, it had its secrets and its ghosts. On the outskirts of town, past the winding roads and overgrown trails, lay Blackthorn Cemetery. Locals spoke of it in hushed tones, warning their children not to wander there after dusk. Blackthorn wasn't just a resting place for the dead. It was a repository of fear, the kind that seeped into bedtime stories and cautionary tales. And at the heart of the graveyard was its most infamous resident, Jonathan Cain. Decades ago, Jonathan Cain had been a drifter who stumbled into Ashwood and found himself accused of a brutal murder. Evidence was scarce, and whispers of his innocence followed his conviction, but the townsfolk wanted someone to blame. The trial was swift, the verdict unanimous. He was hanged in the town square, his last words a curse. "This town will never know peace until the truth is unearthed." They buried him in Blackthorn, away from the respectable dead, and his grave was marked only by a rough, weather-beaten headstone. Over time, rumors spread that his spirit lingered, angered by the injustice done to him. Some claimed to hear his voice in the wind. Others swore they saw shadows moving between the graves. The legend took on a life of its own, and one chilling detail stood out. Anyone who dared to disrespect his grave would be met with unrelenting revenge. Emily was the kind of girl who thrived on pushing boundaries. At 21, she was rebellious to a fault, a self-proclaimed skeptic who rolled her eyes at the town's superstitions. While others avoided Blackthorn Cemetery, Emily found its eerie reputation thrilling. She loved a good scare, especially when it meant mocking what she called old wives' tales. So, when her friends dared her to dance on Jonathan Cain's grave, Emily didn't hesitate. They were sitting around a bonfire in her friend Jake's backyard, swapping ghost stories and draining cans of cheap beer. The conversation had turned to Blackthorn, and it didn't take long for the story of Jonathan Cain to resurface. "You wouldn't last 5 minutes in that graveyard," Jake teased, grinning as he poked at the fire. "Please," Emily scoffed, leaning back in her chair. "It's just a bunch of stones and overgrown grass. There's nothing scary about that place." "What about Jonathan Cain's grave?" chimed in Mia, her voice low and theatrical. "They say his spirit will hunt down anyone who mocks him." Emily rolled her eyes. Jonathan Cain was a scapegoat for a murder the town couldn't solve. The only thing haunting Blackthorn is everyone's imagination. Jake smirked. "If you're so sure, why don't you prove it? Dance on his grave, midnight tonight." The group erupted in laughter, but Emily didn't flinch. She met Jake's gaze, her own eyes alight with defiance. "Fine," she said, standing up and grabbing her coat. "You're on." The night was colder than Emily expected as she trudged along the dirt path leading to Blackthorn Cemetery. The flashlight in her hand wavered slightly, not from any failure of its batteries, but from her unsteady grip. She shook off the creeping unease, forcing herself to remember why she was here. It's just a dare, nothing to worry about. She reached the cemetery gate, its iron bars twisted with age and rust. The hinges creaked as she pushed it open, the sound echoing into the night like a drawn-out groan. Emily rolled her eyes. "Seriously?" "A horror movie couldn't have staged this better," she muttered, stepping into the graveyard. Rows of headstones stretched out before her, leaning at odd angles like crooked teeth. The trees surrounding the cemetery swayed gently in the wind, their skeletal branches clawing at the starless sky. Her phone buzzed with a message, Jake, asking if she'd chickened out yet. Emily smirked, typing back a quick reply. Not a chance. With renewed determination, she navigated the overgrown paths until she found it. Jonathan Cain's grave. It sat at the farthest edge of the cemetery, partially obscured by ivy and thyme. The headstone was cracked, but still readable under the beam of her flashlight. Jonathan Cain, 1887 to 1910. Condemned, but not forgotten. Here you are, Jonathan, she said, her breath visible in the chill air. She pulled her phone from her pocket and selected an upbeat song. The music blared to life, an odd juxtaposition to the eerie silence of the cemetery. Emily couldn't help but chuckle at the absurdity. She set the flashlight on the ground, its beam casting a ghostly glow over the grave, and began to dance. Her movements were exaggerated and mocking. Wild spins, exaggerated twirls, and deliberate stomps over the soft earth. Take that, Jonathan, she taunted, her laughter cutting through the music. Your curse is nothing but a stupid story. In her enthusiasm, Emily swung around too quickly, knocking over her drink. The bottle rolled to the base of the headstone, its contents spilling onto the moss-covered granite. The liquid spread in dark rivulets, soaking into the earth below. Oops, she said with a laugh, bending down to pick it up. But as her fingers brushed the bottle, the air around her shifted. The wind stilled, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. The music on her phone stuttered, distorted for a moment before falling silent altogether. Emily froze, suddenly hyper-aware of the unnatural stillness. She glanced at her phone, but the screen was unresponsive, the battery inexplicably drained. Okay, that's weird, she whispered, her voice sounding too loud in the quiet. The air grew colder, biting against her skin. She reached for her flashlight, but before she could grab it, the ground beneath her feet trembled, a subtle, almost imperceptible vibration that sent a jolt of panic through her chest. All right, you made your point, she said, forcing a laugh. Very funny. The ground shuddered again, stronger this time, accompanied by a low, guttural sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Her flashlight flickered violently, casting dancing shadows that seemed to stretch and twist like living things. And then came the whispers. They started softly, a faint murmur that tickled the edges of her hearing. Words she couldn't quite make out swirled around her, growing louder, more insistent. It was as if the voices were speaking directly into her mind, pressing against her skull with an unbearable weight. No, she whispered, backing away from the grave. This isn't happening. Her retreat was halted by the sensation of something brushing against her arm. She spun around, heart hammering, but there was nothing there, only the dark, yawning void of the cemetery. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, and the trembling ground seemed to pulse beneath her feet. Emily's instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs felt rooted to the spot. The headstone before her seemed to shift, the cracks along its surface deepening as if the stone itself were breathing. A faint light emanated from the ground, a sickly green glow that seeped through the dirt like a malevolent spirit rising from the earth. Jonathan, she whispered, her voice trembling. I'm sorry. I didn't mean. Her apology was cut short by a violent gust of wind, icy and sharp, that tore through the cemetery. Her flashlight gave one last flicker before plunging her into total darkness. And in that moment, Emily knew she had awakened something that had been waiting for far too long, something that would not rest again. Emily stumbled into her small apartment just past midnight, the cold from Blackthorn Cemetery clinging to her skin. Her hands were shaking as she locked the door behind her. She tossed her coat onto the couch and collapsed onto her bed, her heart still racing from the strange events at the graveyard. She told herself it was nothing. A mix of nerves and overactive imagination. But deep down, she felt the creeping dread she couldn't explain away. That night, sleep came reluctantly. When it finally did, it wasn't the restful escape Emily had hoped for. Her dreams were vivid, terrifyingly real, pulling her into a world she didn't recognize but felt disturbingly familiar. In her dream, she stood among a crowd in the town square, their faces obscured by shadowy blurs. The air was thick with tension, and the weight of judgment hung heavy. Before her stood Jonathan Cain, a man in his early 20s, his face pale but defiant. His wrists were bound, and a rough noose encircled his neck. His dark eyes scanned the crowd, landing directly on Emily. "You did this," he said, his voice resonating with a chilling clarity. "No." Emily tried to protest, but her words came out as a whisper. She wasn't part of this mob, wasn't even alive when this happened. Yet her hands felt sticky, stained with blood she didn't recognize. The crowd jeered as Jonathan was dragged to the gallows, their chants drowning out her protests. Emily tried to move to stop them, but her feet were rooted to the spot. She was forced to watch as the executioner pulled the lever. Jonathan's body dropped, and his gaze never left hers. "You will feel what I felt." His voice echoed in her head. As the scene dissolved into darkness, Emily jolted awake, gasping for air. Her room was silent, bathed in pale moonlight filtering through the curtains. But something was wrong. The air felt heavy, charged with an unnatural energy. She sat up, her heart pounding, and scanned the room. Her desk lamp, which she always kept on her nightstand, was now on the opposite side of the room. The books stacked neatly on her shelf were toppled, scattered across the floor. "Did I do this?" she muttered, rubbing her temples. She reached for her phone, only to find the screen cracked, something that hadn't been there earlier. Her reflection in the spider-webbed glass startled her. For a split second, it didn't look like her at all. The shadowed eyes and twisted smirk belonged to someone else. "Just a dream," she whispered, but her voice wavered. "It's just a stupid dream." The sound of shattering glass pulled her attention to the bathroom. She crept toward the door, every nerve in her body screaming to turn back. The bathroom mirror had cracked down the center, splitting her reflection into distorted halves. As she stared at the fracture, she caught movement behind her, an inky shadow flitting across the room. She spun around, but there was nothing there. The next morning, Emily was too rattled to focus on much. She decided to check in with Jake and Mia, hoping a shared laugh about the dare would shake the uneasy feeling lingering from the night before. But when she called Jake, his voice was tense. "Did something weird happen to you last night?" he asked. Emily hesitated. "Weird how?" Jake's voice dropped to a whisper. "I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw this guy staring at me. He looked like, I don't know, like he was angry, and my living room light kept flickering all night." Mia called shortly after. Her experience was even worse. "Emily, I swear someone was in my room. I kept hearing whispers, but when I turned the lights on, nothing was there. And my cat won't stop hissing at the walls. It's like she's seeing something I can't." Emily's stomach churned. The eerie happenings weren't just in her head. Whatever she had disturbed at Blackthorn Cemetery had followed her, and now it was spreading to her friends. That evening, the tension in Emily's apartment grew unbearable. The shadows on the walls seemed to move on their own, shifting and stretching as if alive. A faint tapping noise began in the kitchen, growing louder and more insistent until it sounded like something or someone was trying to claw its way through the walls. When she tried to leave the apartment, the doorknob burned her palm, forcing her to retreat. Her phone buzzed, but every message was the same. You can't run. Desperate, Emily grabbed the flashlight she'd taken to the graveyard and shone it into the dark corners of her apartment. For a moment, everything seemed still. But then, the beam illuminated a figure, a tall, dark silhouette standing in the corner of her room, motionless yet menacing. Her scream pierced the silence as the figure dissolved into smoke, leaving behind only a chilling whisper that echoed in her mind. You mocked me. Now you'll pay. The strange occurrences continued, growing more intense with each passing hour. The nightmare had crossed into reality, and Emily realized with growing terror that Jonathan Cain's revenge was far from over. The days following Emily's encounters with the unseen presence in her apartment dragged on like an endless nightmare. Each night, the whispers grew louder, each shadow more tangible. She couldn't escape the sense that something or someone was watching her, waiting for her to make things right. The guilt gnawed at her. What had she done by mocking the grave, by disrespecting Jonathan Cain? The legend might have been nothing more than an old ghost story to most, but she had learned too well that legends often had a sinister truth buried beneath them. Unable to sleep or focus, Emily spent her days researching Jonathan Cain's history, desperate for answers. She scoured the local library, combing through dusty newspapers and yellowed files. What she found wasn't what she expected. In the old, brittle pages of the town's historical records, Emily stumbled upon a detailed account of Jonathan Cain's trial. The story painted a far different picture from the one she had imagined. Jonathan had been a young man in love with a woman named Abigail Thomas, the daughter of a wealthy local merchant. The two were inseparable, but the town's gossip mill ran rampant, fueling rumors of a relationship between Abigail and another man, a rival suitor named Peter Hawthorne. When Abigail was found dead in her family's home, the town was quick to point fingers. Peter had been the obvious suspect, but the real culprit was far less predictable. Abigail's body had been discovered with a locket in her hand, Jonathan's locket. In her final moments, Abigail had tried to defend herself against Peter's advances, but the tragic wound had been inflicted by someone close to her. Emily read the trial's findings with growing disbelief. Abigail's death had been ruled as a result of a violent struggle. Yet, in a twist of fate, Jonathan had been accused of her murder. Why? Because Abigail had been seen leaving his home the night of her death. A jealous Abigail had lied to her family about Jonathan's intentions, leaving out the details of Peter's violent pursuit. But it was too late. Her lies were accepted as truth, and Jonathan was wrongfully condemned. The final blow came when Abigail's father, desperate for revenge on the man he believed had wronged his daughter, planted the locket in Jonathan's possession. The evidence was damning, and the townspeople, eager for a scapegoat, sentenced him to hang. In her research, Emily found the line that made her stomach drop. Jonathan Cain was innocent, betrayed by a lover's jealous lie, his name forever cursed by the very people who killed him. Armed with the knowledge of Jonathan Cain's innocence, Emily knew she had to confront the spirit. It was no longer just about the dare or her mocking actions. It was about righting the wrong she had unknowingly helped perpetuate. She couldn't let the spirit's pain continue to torment her, and worse, her friends. The truth had to be known. With a heavy heart, Emily set out for Blackthorn Cemetery once more. The day had been overcast, clouds hanging low in the sky like a curtain waiting to drop. Her fingers trembled as she gripped the old, rusted gate that had once creaked behind her. The cemetery seemed eerily quiet, and for a moment, Emily wondered if she'd imagined everything. The shadows, the whispers, the cold air. But then she saw the grave again. Jonathan Cain's grave, surrounded by the overgrown weeds and encroaching ivy. Her heart sank. She could feel the presence again, the same oppressive weight in the air. It was as if the grave itself was waiting for her. Emily knelt by the headstone, her knees pressing against the damp earth. She closed her eyes for a moment, collecting her thoughts. "I'm sorry, Jonathan," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I had no idea. I didn't know what happened to you. The ground beneath her feet trembled once more. The earth groaned with a deep, resonating sound that seemed to echo through her very bones. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. This time, there was no mistaking it. Something was waking up. The air turned cold, the temperature dropping sharply. Emily's hands shook, but she pressed on. "I want to help you. I'm here to make things right." She placed her hand on the headstone, the stone cold and unyielding beneath her touch. "Please, let me help you find peace." At first, there was only silence. The whispers that had once plagued her seemed distant now, muffled by the silence that hung heavy in the graveyard. But then, a faint glow began to pulse from the cracks in the stone, and Emily's heart pounded in her chest. Suddenly, the ground erupted. A dark figure, tall and imposing, rose from the earth with an otherworldly scream that sent a chill through her entire body. Jonathan Cain stood before her, his body ethereal and transparent, yet his eyes blazed with an intensity that pierced through the darkness. His face was contorted in anguish and rage, his features twisted in the pain of a wrongful death that had never been avenged. "You mocked me," Jonathan's voice rang out, cold and bitter, reverberating in the very air around them. "You disturbed my grave, laughed at my pain. Do you think an apology can undo what has been done to me?" Emily stepped back, fear crawling up her spine. "I'm sorry. I didn't know. I thought it was just a joke. Please." His eyes flashed with anger, and the temperature dropped even further. The winds howled as if in response, the trees around them swaying violently. "You thought I was a joke?" Jonathan's form flickered, as if struggling against the chains that bound his spirit. "I suffered for your amusement, and now I will make you feel my suffering." A deep rumble echoed from the earth, and the shadows stretched long across the graveyard. Emily's knees weakened, and her hands trembled violently as she realized the truth. Jonathan Cain's pain wasn't just a memory. It was a living, breathing thing, and she had awakened it, only to find that no apology, no gesture of goodwill would be enough to stop the vengeful spirit that now blamed her for his suffering. "You will never leave this place," Jonathan snarled, his form beginning to blur and distort. "You will suffer as I did." With a sudden, bone-chilling scream, the figure lunged at her, his hands reaching out with desperate fury. Emily gasped, stumbling backward, and in that moment, she understood. The revenge of Jonathan Cain had only just begun. The storm came out of nowhere, as if summoned by some unseen force, with thunder that rumbled through the sky like the growl of a trapped beast. Emily hadn't been able to shake the image of Jonathan Cain's spirit from her mind since their last encounter. Each night, the whispers continued to torment her, becoming louder, more insistent, as if the very air around her crackled with an energy she couldn't understand. She had tried to ignore it, hoping that the nightmare would fade, But deep down, she knew she was far from free. The curse had been awakened, and now she could feel it pulling her back toward the graveyard. It was midnight when the air grew heavy with an unnatural stillness. The wind had died down, but the pressure in the atmosphere was palpable, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Emily was sitting on her bed, staring at the ceiling, when she felt it, the tug, subtle but undeniable. Her phone vibrated in her hand, a text message flashing across the screen. It was from one of her friends who had witnessed the dare that night at the graveyard. The message was short and simple. Come to the graveyard. It's not over. Emily's blood ran cold as a strange, cold sensation gripped her chest. She knew she had to go. Somehow she knew the storm was a sign, a final warning. The graveyard was exactly as it had been the first time Emily had entered it. Dark, quiet, and eerily still. The once tangled ivy now seemed to be alive, curling around the gravestones like creeping fingers. The clouds above were thick and oppressive, and the moon, hidden behind the dark blanket of storm clouds, cast no light on the path ahead. Emily's breath came in short bursts as she clutched the flashlight in one hand and her phone in the other, the light casting a trembling beam that only seemed to highlight the growing shadows around her. As she walked deeper into the graveyard, the wind suddenly picked up, howling like a lost soul. Emily's heart began to race. The whispers had returned, this time sharper and more insistent, swirling around her like 1,000 voices, but she couldn't make out the words. It felt as if the very earth beneath her feet was calling out to her. Then she reached it, the grave of Jonathan Cain. The headstone stood at an unnatural angle, as if it had shifted since her last visit. The air grew colder still, and Emily shivered despite herself. It was then that she noticed something strange. An eerie glow seemed to emanate from the ground itself, pulsing in rhythm with the thundering storm. The whispers grew louder, almost as if the very soil was speaking to her, calling her closer. Without thinking, Emily knelt beside the grave, her heart pounding in her chest. The moment her fingers touched the cold stone, it happened. With a deafening crack, the earth shook violently beneath her feet. The ground trembled, a violent, unnatural force pushing against the surface. The soil seemed to shift and rise, as if something was trying to claw its way out from beneath the earth. Emily screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the storm's fury. She backed away, her flashlight flickering wildly in her hand. And then, with a final earth-shaking force, the grave exploded open. Dirt and debris flew into the air as the ground split wide, revealing the dark, twisted form of Jonathan Cain, rising from the earth itself. He emerged from the grave like a nightmare come to life. His body spectral but solid, his eyes glowing with a fiery rage that cut through the storm like a blade. His face was a twisted mask of anger and betrayal, his once handsome features now contorted into an eternal snarl. The storm above seemed to grow wilder, the winds howling in fury as Jonathan's body slowly took shape. His clothing was tattered, his skin pale and deathly, but his presence was undeniable. He was real. He was alive in some dark, twisted way. Jonathan Cain's eyes locked onto Emily, and she felt a cold, suffocating pressure tighten around her chest. He moved toward her with a slow, deliberate pace, each step heavy and laden with the weight of centuries of pain and rage. "You shouldn't have come back," Jonathan's voice boomed, the sound of his words like thunder crashing around her. His tone was filled with venom, his voice the very echo of betrayal. "You think you can undo the wrongs of the past with a few words, that you can make it right?" Emily's breath hitched, and her legs threatened to buckle beneath her. Fear coursed through her veins, but she stood her ground, though her body trembled uncontrollably. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. I didn't mean to mock you, she managed, her voice barely audible over the wind and thunder. I didn't know what happened to you. I didn't know about the lies, the betrayal. Please, Jonathan, I'm sorry. I'll help you. I'll make sure your name is cleared. I'll tell the truth. I swear it. Jonathan's eyes blazed with an otherworldly fire, and he stopped just inches from her. The force of his presence pushed against her chest like an invisible wall, the air so thick she could hardly breathe. He looked down at her, his expression one of both pity and rage. You think that will fix what was done to me? Jonathan's voice softened, but there was no mercy in it. I died for a lie, Emily. My name was erased from history, and my soul has been trapped in this torment for centuries because of the lies of others. And now you come here, begging for my forgiveness. Tears welled in Emily's eyes, and her voice cracked as she pleaded. I can't change the past, but I can tell everyone the truth. I can expose the lies. Please don't do this. Don't take my life too. Jonathan's form flickered for a moment, the rage in his eyes softening just slightly, as if he was considering her words. But then, his expression hardened again, and the ground trembled beneath them once more. You may tell the truth, he growled, but it will never change what has been done to me. No one will ever truly know the suffering I endured, the agony of a life cut short by betrayal. No apology will bring me peace. No story will give me back what was taken. Emily dropped to her knees, her body shaking with both fear and desperation. Then let me help you find peace. Let me be the one to finally give you justice. I promise I'll never stop, Jonathan. I swear. Jonathan's eyes flickered, and for a moment the storm seemed to quiet. But then the winds returned with a violent fury, and Jonathan's form darkened again, his rage boiling over. You are not the one who can undo this. You will suffer as I have suffered. Your life will be a part of this curse. Before Emily could react, Jonathan's hand shot out, gripping her wrist with an unrelenting strength. The world around her seemed to spiral as she gasped for air, her vision blurring. She felt the energy in the air shift, the storm surging around them. But in that moment, a single thought echoed through her mind. There was no escape from the reckoning now. The days after that stormy night were a blur for Emily. Her body was bruised, her spirit shattered, but the resolve she had forged in the face of Jonathan Cain's wrath had stayed with her. It wasn't just a matter of clearing her conscience anymore. It was about undoing the wrongs of the past and giving Jonathan the justice he had been denied in life. She had promised him something, and now she had to keep that promise, no matter the cost. The world had moved on from Jonathan Cain long ago. The whispers about his wrongful death had faded into the fabric of town history, nothing more than a faded rumor that was rarely spoken of. But Emily knew better now. She had seen the truth. She had felt it, in the coldness of Jonathan's vengeful spirit, and in the horrific images of his trial, his hanging, his life destroyed by a single lie. She went to work, gathering every shred of evidence she could find about Jonathan's case. She combed through old records, pored over news clippings from the time of his death, and interviewed the town's elderly residents who still remembered the scandalous trial. Slowly but surely, she uncovered the details. How Jonathan had been accused of murder, framed by a jealous lover who twisted the truth and led to his untimely execution. The more Emily unearthed, the more furious she became. She couldn't just keep this hidden. Not after everything she had experienced. She had to expose the lies not just for Jonathan, but for herself, for the peace she had promised him. She turned to social media, writing posts filled with the damning evidence she had gathered. She contacted local newspapers, sending them everything she had learned about Jonathan's story, including witness statements, court transcripts, and even a heartfelt letter she had written to Jonathan's surviving relatives. She knew that in a small town like this, it would get attention. The media response was swift, and before long, Jonathan Cain's name was splashed across headlines. The townsfolk, who had long buried the truth, now found themselves forced to confront the wrong that had been done. It didn't take long for a public outcry to erupt, demanding justice for Jonathan, even if it came too late. It didn't take long after the truth came out for the hauntings to stop. The whispers, the shifting objects, the cold drafts, all of it vanished, as if the spirit that had tormented Emily had finally found some semblance of peace. The chilling presence of Jonathan Cain was no longer there, and for the first time in weeks, Emily felt the weight of the supernatural world that had once held her captive begin to lift. But that didn't mean Emily was free. The scars of her encounter with Jonathan, the terror she had felt, the guilt she carried, those things didn't vanish with the storm. The truth may have been exposed, but there was no erasing the darkness she had experienced, no forgetting the tormented spirit she had come to know. Though the hauntings had ceased, Emily was left with a lingering sense of dread that never quite left her. She couldn't escape the visions of Jonathan Cain that would sometimes appear before her. His angry eyes, his twisted face, his outstretched hand, as if reminding her that no matter what she did, she could never truly undo the damage. These moments came in flashes, sudden and unexpected, as if Jonathan's spirit were trying to reach her from the other side. Sometimes, she would wake in the middle of the night to the feeling of his cold breath against her neck, or see his silhouette reflected in a mirror when she wasn't looking. Her life had returned to normal, but Emily knew that the peace she had fought for was fragile. The truth had been set free, but it had come at a heavy price. The cost wasn't just in the damage to her psyche, it was in the weight of the responsibility she now carried. She had disrupted something that could never truly be put to rest, and in doing so, she had become part of a larger, darker story. She was forever marked by the curse of Jonathan Cain, even if the supernatural torment had ended. As for the graveyard, the townsfolk did not return. What had once been a place of whispered fear, where children dared each other to venture after dark, had now become a permanent symbol of a dark past. The grave of Jonathan Cain, now exposed as the site of a wrongful death, had become a relic of tragedy, a monument to the corruption of truth and the injustice of time. The town tried to forget the place, to let it fade back into the overgrown woods, but there was no returning to the innocence it had once known. A few brave souls still ventured near it, but the graveyard was no longer the gathering place for curious teens looking for thrills. It was abandoned, silent and forgotten, its place in the town's history sealed in a way that no one could change. For Emily, the graveyard became a symbol of her own fragile peace, a reminder of the thin line between justice and vengeance. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind howled through the trees, she would find herself standing at her window, staring toward the distant horizon where the graveyard stood, its silhouette barely visible through the trees. The place was no longer haunted in the traditional sense, but Emily couldn't help but feel the weight of its legacy pressing down on her. Emily's life continued, slowly, painfully. She was no longer the rebellious young woman who had once mocked the town's stories, nor was she the terrified girl who had danced on Jonathan Cain's grave. she had become something else. Someone who had faced the darkness and come out scarred, but still breathing. The truth had been uncovered. The spirit had been released, but the burden of that truth would stay with her forever. And though the town had tried to move on, to forget the curse of the graveyard, Emily knew that the legend of Jonathan Cain would live on. It would be told again and again, passed from generation to generation as a warning, a lesson about the dangers of injustice, of betrayal, and of what happens when the truth is buried too deeply for too long. But the graveyard? It would always remain there, standing silent and abandoned, a place where the past had come alive and where it had found its resolution in the most unexpected of ways. And for Emily, it would forever remain a reminder of the night the dead had risen and the price that had been paid for redemption.